The AI podcast brings you new and innovative insights from AI and machine learning researchers and developers. The podcast is brought to you by your co-hosts, Arijit and Christian.
Right. Welcome to this new format. We are looking at a shorter format this time. And it's just Christian and I. We're going to talk through a recent paper that we read through and we really loved.
Yeah, so there's a paper from Apple, The Illusion of Thinking, which created a lot of attention. Very interesting paper. But then there was a rebuttal to it, if you like, from Anthropic, the illusion of thinking, which I love that name. So some real kind of controversy there in the AI space. So yeah, we'd like to kind of dive into that a little bit. The title, The Illusion of Thinking: Understanding the Strengths and Limitations of Reasoning Models via the Lens of Problem and Complexity. As ever, tells you nothing. Arijit, why don't you explain kind of what they got up to?
Recently, large language models have this reasoning functionality in them. Some of them can only reason. Some of them, it's also switch on and off function. We can switch the reasoning on and off. And there are some which are like the old style large language models which do not reason at all. The human comparison to reasoning is effectively things that you're saying off the top of your head. Like if you're performing without practice, that's what a large language model would do. If you are thinking through what you're saying, maybe you have a pen and paper to jot down certain things as you are working things out. That's more the reasoning side of things, or the LRMs, the large reasoning models. That's what they do. But
it's kind of like it's like a self-reflective conversation. The ones where I've seen them where they've actually exposed to thinking. The style of it, they are still language models, so they're still using their language model capability, but it's kind of asking itself things and going, oh well, if that, then I should look at that, and off it goes. And then it's iterative thinking, but it's very much the thinking out loud. It does feel very human. It's almost comical in a way sometimes when you read the transcripts.
Correct. I think it'll be equally comical if we could hear each other's internal thoughts as well.
Yeah, it'd be embarrassing. Yeah.
So Apple came up with this way of creating like a benchmark, which cannot be cheated on effectively. So it's come up with 4 different puzzles. So they chose these 4 puzzles: the Tower of Hanoi, checkers jumping, river crossing, and blocks world. And we'll discuss in a bit more detail as to each of them. But the idea was that the complexity of each of these puzzles could be tweaked by some parameters and therefore make it more and more difficult for the LLM and the LRMs, the large language model and large reasoning models, to solve these without it being a benchmark that can be cheated on. Okay, so we'll start with Tower of Hanoi. Tower of Hanoi, pretty famous, is a stacking problem where you have a orderly stack of desks. On one pole, you've got 3 poles. And the idea is to move the stack from one extreme to the other extreme. So if you have the stack on the left pole, you use the middle pole, but the final result should be the stack goes on the right pole. The only constraint of the game is no large disk could go on a smaller disk. I don't know whether it's true, but when I first learned about the Tower of Hanoi, someone explained to me like there was actually like a temple of Hanoi where there was the stack of 64 desks, and the idea was like there was a monk or a priest or someone or a group who were doing this all the time, and once all the 64 desks went to the final stack, the universe would come to an end. And you laugh, right? But the number is so exponentially large. The number of moves increases exponentially with the number of disks. So 64 disks, it is on the order of like millions of years, even if you're doing 1 second a move. The checkers jumping is simple. The checkers jumping is effectively you need to switch the places between blue and red checkers. It's a linear pile, but the complexity here again increases with the number of checkers that you have on the board. So again, you can see a pattern forming here with the problems. Simple problems, but the number of steps radically increases with some parameter, right? The number of disks, the number of checkers, river crossing. This is the whole sort of cannibal versus missionaries. You might have heard that version of it, right? And
Yeah.
on any bank, if there is more cannibals than missionaries, they will eat them up or something like that, right? So and here again, there is another parameter, which is the number of people which can be let onto the boat, as well as the number of missionaries and cannibals that you can tweak to make it more complex. And the fourth and the last one, blocks world, is effectively moving blocks from one place or stacking blocks, but you can only move the top layer block. So again,
Similar to Tower of Hanoi, but there's no size sequencing.
correct. Yeah, the size constraint is removed. So again, all four of them, the idea was that the researchers at Apple could tweak the number of parameters and make it more complex for the LLMs and the LRMs. You could argue it's pedantic rather than difficult, and we'll come to that. I'm not foreshadowing it.
Yeah, and I think they freely admit this in the conclusion that there were limitations, but they were looking to see if they could find things which were controllable, but not predetermined. So these are logic things that mean the only way to solve these is using reasoning.
Yep.
Arguably, it's not pattern recognition.
So effectively, they saw that for each of the problems, they could divide the problem up into low, medium, and high complexity. The complexity was defined by the number of disks in the Tower of Hanoi, number of checkers, so on and so forth. In the low complexity regime, you had the LLMs, the ones that did not have the reasoning, right? The normal bog standard large language models, they outperformed the LRMs. And this partially goes to what you were saying before, right? Because reasoning, you could say, is a form of inefficiency, because you're thinking too much about a problem, which is a simple solution, right?
Yeah, it's essentially overthinking, isn't it? They probably just made it harder for themselves by if you're running a process which forces itself to go, oh, what if this? When the answer is just like 1 + 1 = 2, and you force reasoning into it, then you're opening the door to go, maybe 1 + 1 = 3. Maybe everyone was wrong. Whereas if you have a simple model, it's just going to go, 1 + 1 = 2. Fine, move on.
Yep.
It's not going to waste any energy.
That
double guessing.
was one of the findings as well, Christian, right? So that was when the researchers looked at the traces of the reasoning, they actually found that sometimes the model would, early in its reasoning, figure out the correct result, but then overthink it. And sometimes, come back to the correct result again, but after a lot of additional thinking. So exactly that, overthinking, it seems to be a common thing in the low complexity problems.
Okay.
However,
on
the medium side, LRMs hit it out of the park. As you'd expect, right? The complexity level is increasing. You need to reason before you blindly do this. It's not a memorized piece. Yeah, I mean, both Claude Thinking, DeepSeek R1, both thinking models significantly outperform their non-thinking counterparts, the Claude 3.7 and the DeepSeek V3 models.
Okay, so far so good. So as the complexity goes up, the benefit of reasoning kicks in.
But what surprised, and this is the thing that caused a lot of controversy and ripples, is what happened in the high complexity zone. In there was a complete loss of performance, and that was for both the LLMs and LRMs. So there seemed to be like a hard wall in terms of the complexity set out in those 4 problems, beyond which neither your large language models or large reasoning models could break through, and it just died down. Anthropic came back with a rebuttal in 3 days. So June 7th was when Apple published the paper, and June 10th is when Anthropic came back out with what they said. So I think let's jump into it, right? So the crux of Anthropic's, I think philosophically, right, and this is me sort of abstracting Anthropic's abstraction, was twofold. One is effectively they pointed out some issues with the actual test themselves. Specifically, sometimes there were some token constraints. We all know this, right? The large language models, and especially large reasoning models, they have token constraints where there's a maximum number of output tokens, and the reasoning tokens also eat up into that. So there is only a limited amount of tokens that the models could output. Now, the Apple researchers did cater for that, right? So they said, here, our sample should cater for this, right, given the max number of tokens. However, LLMs do tend to be conservative on tokens, right? So that's exactly what Anthropic found out when, in their minimal, right? They did not do a huge volume testing, but what they saw was when they were saying, "Hey, solve Tower of Hanoi with 20 disks," the LRMs were coming to a conclusion and saying, "Oh no, you know what? It's going to take too many tokens."
Yeah, they actually saw evidence of that in the reasoning trace. Reading through that, there were trace bits that said, and I quote here, the pattern continues, but to avoid making this too long, I'll stop here. Which is exactly the AI basically saying, yeah, this looks like it's going to be too big, I'm done. So it's constrained itself to stop thinking, and therefore obviously hasn't got to the right conclusion because it's just, it's quit the race.
Yeah. Again, staying on the problem with the actual setup, and this was a bit of a gotcha, right? Some of the problems, especially in the river crossing problem, they were insolvable, right? With the size of the boat, with constraints on the size of the boat, there was when the number of cannibals and missionaries goes over a particular number, the problem becomes unsolvable until the boat size is increased. Apple missed on that. So actually, when Anthropic tried to recreate that, the model came back and said, this is not solvable. And Anthropic feels that Apple might have taken that as a failure. For me, though, the second portion of the rebuttal, which was a bit more philosophical, is probably a bit more, I think, more relevant, because it sort of underlines on what do we think is actual thinking, right? It's like saying, like, are you articulate? And is articulation the same as writing maybe a 1,000-word essay? So I'll explain, right? Anthropic is trying to say the complexity of the problems, it's just complexity in terms of the length of the solutions, actually. The complexity is not on the order of like, hey, I have to think harder about this. This is a more challenging problem. Solving the problem is simple, probably trivial, but it's just a repetition. So they are challenging whether this is actually a good way of testing out the model's capability in thinking, because this is not really thinking, it's just, doing the same thing over and over again.
Isn't that the difference in some of them? Like Tower of Hanoi is iterative. It's just do a simple, relatively simple task lots of times and don't drop the ball. And it could be like 50, 60 different iterations. So, there's lots of opportunities mathematically to drop the ball and make one slip, and if you make one slip, the whole thing comes out with the wrong answer. But something like river crossing is a different kind of logic and isn't as iterative. It's more that you really do have to strategize, which I buy. That does make sense. And there were differences between some of the models. Like I forget which one it was. There was one model that performed very well at Tower of Hanoi. It got a 20 stack. And it got the right answer. But then when it tried to do river crossing in a relatively simple river crossing, it just got confused and didn't get there. Exactly the same model. So it's slightly weird. And they were thinking maybe that was to do with the fact that Tower of Hanoi is widely discussed. So probably is more present in its training data, and therefore it's probably got a better kind of gut feel of how to move forward with that problem than it did with river crossing. But so it's I know at the beginning we said the whole point of these is that your training data shouldn't have any impact. But I think they also kind of got to a point of going, well, no, actually maybe it does. So that's interesting too.
Yeah, so Apple made that comment saying maybe Tower of Hanoi was in the training data where the river crossing wasn't. Anthropic's counter to that is effectively saying that river crossing, you're right, needs a lot of strategy, But the strategy equates to thinking tokens as well, right? For a LRM. So if it's making a misstep, it's also writing it down. So again, the token constraint comes in much quicker for lower numbers of n for river crossing than Tower of Hanoi. So they're effectively saying the branching factor is much higher for river crossing.
Yeah, I can see you've just got it on the screen. You've just got conclusion coming up. I genuinely love the conclusion on the Anthropic paper.
It's a bit tongue in cheek, right?
Yeah, it's snidey as hell, but I love it. It's basically, and I can summarize their 4 points into just do good science.
Yeah, exactly. Try harder, Apple.
Yeah. You could tell they were feeling very smug and having a lot of Schadenfreude when they wrote this, but good for them.
Yeah. So I think this is quite nice because it's a topic of discussion, debate might be, but this is how science has always been, right? There are different points of views. They're both out there. They've got their logical reasoning behind it, and people can read both of them and choose which point of view they support.
Yeah, I think there's some genuinely some good takeaways here. So the original problem that Apple were trying to say is measuring large reasoning model capability is difficult. So they were trying to come up with a better way of doing it, a more robust way of doing it. And I think, respect for doing that. They made some mistakes, some just kind of rather than anything else that they didn't think through enough. But I think it's good. And to be fair, the rebuttal kind of saying, look, if you're going to do this stuff, make sure that your tests are fair, make sure that everything is kind of possible. But I think the lower threshold finding between, when you've got relatively simple problems, don't use a reasoning model on a simple problem. It won't perform as well as a simple model will. I think that's useful because people love to bring out the big guns for everything because they feel like they're doing a great job because they've got the biggest, most performing model. But it's literally not the most performing model on simple problems. In the increasingly agentic flows that we're doing, lots of the those little agent tasks are not complex by design. There might be a stage where you really do need reasoning, but in your design architectures, think carefully about which model you're deploying. So that's a genuine finding that
that's a very
valid
point.
Thank Apple for showing us.
Anthropic came about another way of solving it, which was just ask the model to code because it's repetitive, right? Can you write a code in whatever language? And all the models passed on that because, hey, they're all great coders.
We tried to keep this short, but I think it's really interesting to see what is cutting edge research doing at the moment. And you've got two huge companies here looking at real problems that the AI industry is challenged with. We want to understand how performative these new models are, but you can see it's not easy. Even in the biggest, the biggest houses out there, they're still making schoolboy errors. So that's probably reassuring for the rest of us, but also a note of caution that even when you've got a very big name out there, that doesn't mean they got it right. Yeah, do your own risk research. Check that things actually work. Double check your work. And I think that will help. But with that, signing off. So here's from Christian. Goodbye.
Thanks for listening and join us next time on the II AI podcast.